George Barrett. I'm an academic and researcher in the field of international relations and critical security studies, and with a specific focus on environmental justice and emancipatory politics. When we talk about social justice today, it's often considered from the grassroots perspective, looking at people's access to resources, opportunities, the enabling environment for that to happen, and also trying to overcome specific institutionalized oppressions and barriers to accessing those resources on an equitable basis, in terms of things like racism, classism, ableism, sexism, because people experience justice and injustice in very different ways depending on their position within society. So we can no longer think of justice just in terms solely of race or solely of gender. We have to consider it in terms of how somebody's position in society, if it's patriarchal, if there's a hierarchy and so forth, how these influence people's access to justice. So intersectionality is critical. And also across space and time, in terms of understanding that we have a responsibility to future generations about the decisions and the practices that we make today, that we do today. We're interested in looking at this issue of water in relation to climate change, specifically in Southern Africa. And the example that I want to talk about is the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, in particular as a case study. It's an interesting case study for reasons that I'll come to in a second, but just more broadly talking about Southern Africa as a region to explain its significance, especially in relation to social justice and climate change, is that over time, Southern Africa is becoming more and more prone to water vulnerability, water scarcity, and in some instances, water stress. And so there have been efforts. South Africa, that's already struggles with accessing enough water, has tried historically, in this particular instance, in the apartheid era, to establish transfer schemes from neighbouring countries, specifically Lesotho, to feed industry and residencies within the Gauteng province, where most of the mining and industry in South Africa happens. The idea being that it would support South African economy, and in return, Lesotho, being a very small, impoverished country, would benefit from royalties from the project and potential for hydroelectric power and community development, job creation and so forth. So this was kind of the idea around the development of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project back in the 80s, although there were earlier attempts to create such programs. And it's a 4-phase project that involves the creation of 6 dams. It's one of the largest dam construction programs in the world. And billions of rands have been spent on this programme, with, as I've suggested, the intention that the revenue would be returned to Lesotho, some of which it has contributed in some years to something like 28% of the GDP of the country. And yet we're not seeing that those benefits trickle down to the communities. And so it's a major issue of social justice for a number of reasons, both in South Africa and in Lesotho. That's not happening. The water is still primarily going to the wealthy areas and to support mining and industry. In Lesotho, what we found is that with the development of the 2 existing dams, is that there's been mass displacement of people. And this has not been a participatory process. This has not been a situation where people have been widely consulted or effectively compensated for being removed from what has been their ancestral land and also the means of their livelihoods, for particularly livestock and agriculture, other forms of agricultural development. It's proven to be a very contentious issue. And in the context of climate change and climate variability, there will be parts of Lesotho that are more prone to flooding, whilst others will be more prone to drought. And we also know that in South Africa, the potential for drought is much higher, particularly in Gauteng, which is a water scarce province, and yet has the highest density of industry and also residential domestic demands on water supply. So the justice is transnational in the sense, the justice issue is transnational in the sense that we are trying to understand how this flow of water might enhance justice in terms of access to water resources amongst local communities in South Africa, and it doesn't seem to be doing that, but also the impact on communities in the Lesotho Highlands areas which have been affected by the dams. There's been some benefits. I don't want to suggest that the Highlands, the water project has been totally bad for the communities. But those benefits are not shared equally. They're not being experienced by everybody within the communities. And a very small number of people have actually seen any of the compensation or the royalties that have come from the water supply. In the context of climate change, where drought is likely to increase in parts of Lesotho, and they already are in a situation where there's only between 9 and 13% of land that's cultivatable, then we're going to see greater experiences of soil erosion and potential deforestation, which would obviously cause flash floods and runoff, so a kind of opposite situation to drought. So climate change is going to really impact water scarcity and stress across the region, and yet South Africa and Lesotho at the kind of high national levels are negotiating still around transfer, because industry is growing in South Africa and the demand is continuing. How is it that we're going to continue to take the water from Lesotho and meet the needs of the Lesotho communities and their water needs? So some of those communities in a country that is water rich are actually now going to also suffer water scarcity. Moving forward, we need to really think about having better planning and assessment processes that take into consideration the social justice aspects of these developments, because this is a technological solution to a challenge that South Africa and Lesotho face, and yet it hasn't really been addressed in terms of social justice.